A week later, he loses the Intercontinental title to Jeff Hardy, but later that night, he teams with Carlito in a handicap match against Triple H. But Triple H is going to hit him with the sledgehammer shot several times, injuring him. That sets up a match with Triple H at No Mercy. It eventually becomes a title match because Triple H wins the belt. Ultimately, though, Triple H wins the pay-per-view match. Umaga is not going to be your champion, but still, it's another marquee spot for Umaga. On November 18th at the 2007 Survivor Series from Miami, Umaga's team would lose to Triple H's team. And as we start to build towards WrestleMania 24 in March of 2008, Umaga was announced as being in the, or facing Batista in a battle between Raw and SmackDown at WrestleMania. And during this period, William Regal is with him, and he calls him Umaga. And in 2013, Regal tweeted, "People ask me a lot why I used to say Umaga the way I did. It was so people would remember it. I'm glad I did. He was a great man." Unfortunately for him, though, Umaga lost at WrestleMania 34. Batista beat him with a botched Batista bomb. He basically fell down when delivering it. During the match, interestingly enough, Umaga's getting cheered and Batista's getting some boos. What do you remember about that match? I mean, it's a pretty notable WrestleMania, of course. We've got the Ric Flair, Shawn Michaels retirement match. Batista, who was a couple years before this, one of the biggest stars in the company, is now working with Umaga, who feels like he's sort of on the rise. I think a lot of fans remember the finish, unfortunately, more than the rest of the match.
Well, it was the era that started to really rear its head about people expressing themselves in a non-traditional way. The audience knew that Umaga was the villain. You should boo him, but that's not how it works. It doesn't work that way now for sure. And it started to change in that era as well, all those years ago. So, I don't think it's an indictment on Dave. Dave had been very heavily, exposed, overexposed, shall we say. But it was a sign of the times. There was something about Umaga that the traditional male 18 to 34 demographic that they wanted to relate to. A lot of those young guys full of P&V wanted to have that same attitude, that same demeanor, that same impact, the feeling of being dangerous and almost unbeatable. They lived vicariously through Umaga in that regard. Now, that's not to say that some of them were also not living vicariously through Batista, but I think Batista in that role, it probably indicated that Dave was past due to turn heel. That's one way of looking at it, but it wasn't shocking. It would have been shocking, 4 or 5 years earlier, but in this changing times and the Attitude Era changed a lot of ways people thought about wrestling that still lingers today. It was just a different deal. So, but it wasn't shocking. Let's put it that way.
Let's talk about what's next for him here, or what could have been rather. This is a bit of a detour, but this same month as WrestleMania, March 2008, a legendary manager, Gary Hart, passes away of a heart attack at his home in Texas at 66 years old. The rumor and innuendo is that you guys had sent out feelers that maybe he could help out with developmental or creative or even do some on-air work. And people like the idea of, hey, what if he came in and was open to doing on-air stuff? He might be a great manager for Umaga as well. Sort of a throwback to the old Hart's Army or H&H Enterprises. Maybe redo Hart as a Don King type with a criminal vibe. Maybe dress him like Suge Knight with a mob style business suit. There was lots of different ideas that were rumors in this era. Do you think there was ever any serious consideration to bringing in Gary Hart here in 2008?
There was consideration, Conrad, but I don't know how serious it was. Gary was a brilliant mind. Gary's contributions would have been equally as valuable as somebody in creative, because he's a former booker. He had a very, very fertile mind creatively, but he also had baggage. Gary was known as somebody that was hard to get along with at times, that he fell in love with his own ideas. If those ideas were not utilized in pretty much their entirety, he was not happy. So I do remember casual conversations about it, but I don't know how serious they were. I'm sure, they were floated by Vince. Vince thought about it. Then you're going to have guys in Vince's ear that, Gary could be a handful, blah, blah, blah. But I thought if Gary could contribute to this company, it would have been in a creative capacity, providing ideas, especially as it relates to building heels. He was very, very good at that. He had a unique run managing Abdullah, the Butcher, for many years off and on, and other guys. He was, Brody, a lot of guys he managed that were big characters and were heels. So Gary had skills, no doubt about that, we could have utilized, but I just think his past was probably biting him in the ass, and it just didn't bode well. So it was just it never got real serious, but it was discussed.
Let's talk about June 23rd, 2008. He's drafted to the SmackDown brand as part of the big draft. He's going to lose to Batista the next night in the main event, but it's by DQ. But unfortunately, some bad news is going to come his way in Johnson City, Tennessee on August 2nd. He suffers a torn PCL and he's going to be on the shelf for a little bit. We do see some promos in late January 2009 hyping his return. And when he does come back, he has a new entrance theme, and he's going to defeat the veteran Jimmy Wang Yang. But unfortunately, Umaga then suffers his first defeat against Triple H by DQ on the March 6th SmackDown. Fast forward to May, and he's back after a 2-month hiatus. He's going to attack CM Punk on multiple occasions, repeatedly interrupting Punk's attempts to cash in his Money in the Bank briefcase. That sets up a match for Judgment Day. Umaga actually beats Punk here, but loses at Extreme Rules on June 7th from New Orleans in a Samoan strap match. And unfortunately, this not only ends their feud, but it's Umaga's last appearance in WWE. Before we talk about the release, let's talk about this run of bad luck, man. You tear your PCL over the summer, they hype up your return, you come back, you're working with Triple H in the main event. For whatever reason, you're on a hiatus. I don't know much about that. I'm hoping maybe you do. But then when he does come back, he's working with who's going to become one of the biggest stars in the company, CM Punk. A couple of matches here on pay-per-view and a Samoan strap match. Man, that's old school. But so was Umaga's style of work. I really liked it. And, I guess if you're going to have a final match in the company, a Samoan strap match with CM Punk on pay-per-view, that's, there are worse ways to have a final match, I suppose. What can you tell us about his run of bad luck here? The stops and starts and injuries along the way.
Well, it's a goddamn shame. It's unfortunate as hell. That's what I said earlier. Along the way, if you're involved in administration and managing talent, you've got to find a way to keep that talent balanced in light or in spite of the fact that they're on this string of bad luck. Some guys handle it and some guys don't. We know Austin handled it. Triple H tears his quad. He handles it. Shawn Michaels, back injury, gone 4 years. He handles it. It's not easy, but it can be done. But you got to have leadership. You got to have positive motivation, and you got to maintain contact. So, a lot of guys are hurt. You think all these guys I mentioned, there's not a week went by I didn't communicate with them when I was in that role. That was my job, and I wanted to know that the office, quote unquote, was thinking about them. So it was just, I said earlier, you worry about how the talent's going to handle this setback, because we knew that Umaga could heal from a torn PCL. Athletes have that happen regularly, seemingly. The kid from Joe Burrow tears his ACL and his MCL and has some bone damage from that knee injury. It could happen to anybody at any time. How's Joe Burrow going to handle that with the Cincinnati Bengals? I suggest he'll probably come through it with flying colors. Drew Brees has 11 broken ribs. I didn't know he had 11 ribs. The quarterback for the New Orleans Saints. I suspect he's going to come back when he comes back and he'll come back successfully. So some athletes have it in them to do that, and some of them mire and get caught in the sludge, and they can't get out of it. It's like getting your feet stuck in quicksand. You got to lift them up and get out of that shit. But and Umaga had some issues with that, and because of his past issues, Vince just came to the end of his rope.